If you're wondering how to get your roses to rebloom again, especially your climbing roses, this video is for you. Last year, I only got one bloom out of my climbing roses. And I decided to change my care routine a tiny bit this year, and I have found a huge success in getting all my climbing roses to rebloom. I have been receiving a ton of questions regarding this, especially about my David Austin, the Albrighton rose, and this is the method that I use this year to get it to rebloom again. These are the 5 steps that I've been using in my rose care routine this year. The first step is the most important one, and that is deadheading the old roses. A lot of the times, especially on climbing roses, because there are so many roses, we don't actually get to the whole rose to deadhead it every single week. That's what happened to me last year. And what I noticed this year when I deadheaded every week, it was saving the rose energy and giving it time to rebloom again. As soon as the rose hips are formed, it is a big red flag for the rose plant because it gives the plant a message that you don't need to produce any more blooms and that it has completed its reproductive cycle by creating new seeds that will be passed on to the next generation. As soon as we deadhead these spent blooms, we direct all the energy of the plant into making new blooms in an attempt to create even more seeds. Now, if you're growing your roses for your rose hips that you might use in medicinal or culinary uses, I would say wait until the end of winter and then just let the roses grow into rose hip. But if you want to have roses throughout the season, it is important to keep deadheading the roses. I recommend deadheading at least once every week. If you really don't have the time, then I would suggest going up to 2 weeks, but preferably try deadheading once every week. The next step is to prune old stems. Usually I don't prune in the middle of summer. For the past 2 years, since I started growing climbing roses, I hadn't pruned them in the middle of summer. I usually leave the pruning towards the end of the season. This year, something different that I did with the roses is prune off any of the thin, diseased looking or almost dead looking stems off of the rose. What that did is, one, it reduced diseases on the roses, and secondly, it also helped the roses put all their energy into creating new stems. Next step is to train the rose. And I have also found that this is a point where I see a lot of new stems coming up on the roses, and this is also the perfect time to start training these stems into whatever shape you want the climbing rose to take. If you leave this step for too late, especially like towards the winter, these stems harden off and then it's harder to actually train them into the shape that you want it to be. Right now, the stems are quite tender and it helps you train the rose any way you want. The way I have trained my roses on the back fence is using an espalier technique. So I wanted it in 3 different levels, and that's the same direction I keep training the new branches in. I look if I have any gaps in between the fence and the rest of the branches, and those are the gaps that I try to fill in at this point. If you're training a brand new rose, then make sure you figure out what kind of design you want it in and start training the rose in that direction. Another tip I have from my experience growing climbing roses is try to train the branches flat rather than train the branches straight up, because if you train the branches flat, what it would do is at every node it would create more and more branches, and it would create a more fuller looking and again more healthier rose, leading to more blooms. The next step is to fertilize the roses. I recommend using alfalfa meal, but I would say that it takes a lot longer for the rose to absorb the alfalfa meal because it takes a while to break down. I have noticed that roses absolutely adore alfalfa, and especially if you're looking for a way to grow your roses organically, just like I am, I would highly recommend it. So I usually recommend fertilizing with alfalfa twice a year. Once in early spring or late winter when you're doing your big prune, and second time is like midsummer. Right now, I think it's a little late to do alfalfa meal because we're in the almost in the end of August and we're moving into September. And this is important for the zones that have frost dates that are coming up in a month or maybe like a month and a half. I wouldn't recommend you fertilize at all at this point using any fertilizer. What I would recommend for you to do is step 3. So hang on for a minute. But for everybody else, if you can't use alfalfa meal, then I would recommend using any other organic rose fertilizer that you are using at this point. The next step, which has been so key in my garden, especially to get abundant blooms in the next cycle, is a foliar spray with kelp fertilizer. Now, what does a foliar spray mean? It basically means you add the kelp fertilizer to water and then just spray the water all over your plant. Drench the leaves and the stems and the entire plant with that fertilizer. The best way for a kelp fertilizer to be absorbed is through the leaves. And this is best done early in the morning when the stomas are open on the leaves, and then they can absorb it really well. If you feel like you don't have time in the morning, then you could also do it a little later in the evening, but I don't recommend watering your roses, especially the leaves, towards the evening because it also leads to increased diseases, especially powdery mildew. So try to fertilize this with the kelp fertilizer early in the morning mixed with water. I think we forget that as all the plants are going through this intense heat during the mid or later months of summer, they also need extra water. So for roses, rather than watering them a little bit every day, water them very deeply, maybe once in 3 days if you're watering for a container plant, or once in 5 days if you're watering a rose in ground. And that's what I try to do even with my roses. And if you feel like you're going through a heat wave, then make sure you water every day. So just be consistent with how much you're watering the roses. Check on your plants every day because they are going through a lot of stress during this time. And once this rose starts going through stress, it will not focus any energies on creating new blooms. It will focus all its energy on keeping the plant alive, especially if it's not getting enough water. So you will see a reduction of blooms. And so if you want more blooms, make sure that the rose is watered really well during the season. I hope these tips help all of you in reblooming all of your roses. And if you're looking for recommendations for which climbing roses to plant in your garden, this is my video for that.